Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video for History by Podcast. Today, I am speaking with Professor Joel Marcus. Joel Marcus is a Professor Emeritus of New Testament and Christian Origins at Duke Divinity School. He taught there regarding the New Testament with an emphasis on the Gospels and the context of early Christianity within Judaism. His publications include 2 monographs on Mark, a 2-volume commentary on the same Gospel in the Anchor Bible series, and a book titled The Way of the Lord, Christological Exegesis of the Old Testament and the Gospel of Mark, and also a monograph on John the Baptist. And today's topic will center on his monograph on John the Baptist. I will include links in the description below to purchase the book. So welcome to the podcast, Joel.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. So let's get right to the questions. Was there a friendly competition between the movements of John the Baptist and Jesus, or were they hostile to one another?
There was competition between those movements. I think that's the first important thing to say. I do think you have to distinguish between what may have been the relationship between the historical Jesus and the historical John the Baptist. And I do think both those people were historical and they did overlap. But there's a difference between talking about what their relationship was with each other and the relationship between the movements that they spawned. So I guess your question was about the latter. And I see competition there already in the New Testament. You have things like the author of the Gospel of John emphasizing in his prologue that John the Baptist, who is different from, the John of John's Gospel, but the author of the Gospel that's ascribed to John says that John was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light. So that's a pretty emphatic statement there. And presumably it's addressed to people. It has people in mind who thought that John the Baptist was the light. So I would see, that's a reflection of some tension between at least one follower of Jesus of Nazareth and some image of John the Baptist. And later on in that gospel, in the very first chapter, people come and ask John who he is he the Messiah? And John tells us he denied. He did not say he was. He denied that he was the Christ. He confessed that he was not the Christ. So again, why do you put that sort of emphasis on his denial that he was the Messiah? Presumably because there were followers of John who thought that he was the Messiah. And we know from some later texts that probably go back to the early 2nd century that indeed there were people who followed John the Baptist and who denied Jesus' messiahship because they thought that John was the Messiah. So there was competition there. Now, was it friendly or not? I mean, I don't see the Gospels as being hostile to John the Baptist. What the Gospel writers want is for the followers of John the Baptist to come into the Christian fold. So basically, the portrait of him is very positive, and he's portrayed as the forerunner of Jesus. And I think that partly reflects historical reality, but it's partly an attempt by later Christians to win over followers of John the Baptist.
Do you think that prior to the deaths of John and Jesus, that their movements were more intertwined, or they were never really unified to begin with?
Well, I think the movements were intertwined if you go back to the time of these two figures. Um, it seems to me that it's probably historical that John was the earlier figure. He had a movement, it was an end time movement. He was proclaiming the coming kingdom of God, or perhaps that the kingdom of God was already here, and that if you wanted to enter into that movement, you had to come to the River Jordan and be baptized by him. And Jesus came and became part of that movement. So, John's movement pre-existed. Jesus joined it. He started out as a follower of John the Baptist, and then he probably went off on his own. But we do have this intriguing account in only in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 3, in which Jesus has a ministry that is concurrent with that of John's, and in which Jesus is also baptizing as John is. It's the only place in the New Testament that it talks about Jesus carrying out a baptismal ministry. So I think probably he started out as an exponent, an apostle of John's own ministry, and then he went off on his own. It's an interesting passage because John tells you in chapter 3 that Jesus was baptizing, but then he emphasizes in the next chapter, no, Jesus wasn't baptizing, it was only his disciples. So he seems to correct the record that has come down to him that he himself has forwarded. So I think what that reveals is that there was a desire by early Christians to distinguish Jesus from John. They didn't want him just to be like John 2.0, but maybe that's trying to cover up the reality that Jesus did start his ministry within John's ministry, and that John was his teacher. He followed John. And then, of course, what often happens is you have somebody who starts out as a member of somebody else's movement, who then breaks away, who thinks that he has an independent thing to say and stuff to do. And so I think often in the history of religions and of movements, you get this almost Oedipal struggle between like the founder and the follower. And I think maybe that's partly what was happening in the case of the movements of John the Baptist and Jesus.
Could you elaborate on what the Elijah role is?
Well, Elijah, of course, for those who know the Old Testament, was a prophet who appeared in Old Testament times and had was a very uncompromising character, denounced the king, was persecuted for it. So that was the historical Elijah, and there's an interesting narrative about at the end of his life, he is not described as having died, but he's taken up into heaven. And if you're taken up into heaven, before you die, then it may be that you'll come back at some point, at some very conclusive moment in history, and do some stuff. And that's the sort of expectation that developed around Elijah. And you see already in the Old Testament, in the book of Malachi, the expectation that Elijah will return before the end. So he'll return. His return will be a sign that the end time is coming. And in some later Jewish traditions, and it's hard to date exactly when this happened, but I think probably before the New Testament, that became an expectation that Elijah would return before the Messiah and would somehow usher in the coming of the Messiah. So Jews today still reflect this tradition of Elijah returning before the Messiah when they have a place set for Elijah at the Passover Seder table, and they open the door and invite him in because, you want Elijah to come because his coming will usher in the time of the Messiah. So that was the expectation of Elijah, and the New Testament, in several passages, the New Testament reflects the idea that John the Baptist was this Elijah who was to come before the Messiah. Now, there is some, they don't all agree on that, because in the Gospel of John, again, John the Baptist explicitly denies that he is the Messiah, that he is not only not the Messiah, but he's also not Elijah. But the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, do present him as fulfilling an Elijah-like role, in that he comes to announce that the end time is about to come. And Elijah is also associated in the Old Testament book of Malachi with judgment. And there are various features of John the Baptist's ministry and the doctrine that's ascribed to him that suggests that he also emphasized that, judgment is coming on the world. Fire is about to fall and burn up all the wicked. So when we talk about the Elijah role with reference to John the Baptist, we're talking about first the picture of him in some New Testament documents as a predecessor to Jesus as the Messiah. And secondly, the question of whether he thought of himself as this Elijah returned from the dead figure. Okay.
You think that the historical John likely did think of himself that way, or there really just is no way of telling which way is more likely the case?
Well, I argue in my book that yes, I think he probably did, and this is a controversial argument. And if I may first outline the case against what I think that's always a good way to start. The case against is that it suits Christian propaganda to portray John as thinking of himself as Elijah, because if John is Elijah and Elijah is supposed to come before not only the end, but also before the Messiah, well, that shows that Jesus is the Messiah. So the argument against is that it fits Christian propaganda. But not all things that fit Christian propaganda are necessarily not true, right? It's like, I think Henry Kissinger once said that just because you're paranoid, that doesn't mean that they're not out to get you, right? So I think, just because, something serves Christian propaganda, that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen. And one of my counter arguments, and this is a little bit involved and a little bit weird, but it has to do with the hairiness of Elijah. He's described in the Old Testament as being a hairy man, and there's various other parts of this description. He has, he wears a leather belt. Well, in the New Testament, John the Baptist is described as wearing a belt about his loins, just like Elijah, but he's not described as hairy. He's described as wearing a hairy garment. So if the New Testament was trying to make John the Baptist look like Elijah, they were just inventing it out of whole cloth, why didn't they go all the way and make him a hairy man? Well, I think the answer is that he was not a hairy man, but he was trying to make himself look as much like Elijah as possible. So that kind of combination of, he's described as sort of like Elijah in physical appearance, but not totally, suggests to me that maybe he did want to identify himself with Elijah, but he couldn't do it totally because he didn't have the necessary hirsuteness. Is that the word? The necessary hairiness. So I mean, it does seem to fit also just with the indications that we have about his preaching being about the end time, since Elijah was expected to be an end time figure. That could go both ways, but I think that is historical.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.